All right, and hey guys, welcome back to the Gulf Coast Growth Show with the Economic Alliance Houston Port Region, our virtual edition. We are here with Texas Railroad Commissioner Ryan Sitton today, and also the founder and CEO of Pinnacle ART. And I'm excited about this episode because we're going to exchange a couple of hats. We're going to have the Railroad Commissioner, and then we're going to put on the business owner, entrepreneur, leader hat on the back half of the episode. And so today is really about kind of oil and gas, what's happening in that dynamic, what we're seeing, and what Ryan's seeing as a projected forecast over the next 12 months. And then we're going to pivot on the back half and talk really about the next 5 years and the forecast that and really position leaders need to take as they go and operate, in a new climate. And Ryan's got a few books that are coming out that are going to support that process over the next 5 years, and we're going to discuss those. He's going to give us a quick backdrop about those. And again, we're excited to have him today. So Ryan, excited to have you on the show today. Thanks for taking time out with us.
Glad to, Jason. It's good to be with you.
Yeah. So I remember distinctly we had you on the wish list with Chad and the gang for the last year or so, and then there was about a 6-month window where you're probably the single busiest person on the planet. It was just we were looking at the calendar. It was like, okay, here's the one chance. So I've had the pleasure, and I know many have, of hearing you speak on different podcasts, speak live and in person with multiple organizations, and so very excited to have you today. The first part of our show today is centered around oil and gas, right? We know you know a thing or two about that. It's really critical to our great state of Texas and really the lifeblood, as far as I'm concerned, and I think we would all agree, of our economy here in the Houston region. And so let's talk about really overarching. So let me start there. Like right now in today's environment, what is your overall consensus, or what are your thoughts in regards to where we stand when it comes to the oil and gas industry?
Well, today is rough. There's no two ways about it. When you think about the amount of oil and natural gas that the world uses, and I'm gonna do a little bit of history here. You go back to 1950, which is when we really first started tracking some data around U.S. oil and natural gas and global oil consumption. In general, it has grown virtually every year, right? And some years more than others, right? You've had some economic booms and everything else, but in general, it's grown every year. And then this year, not only did it shrink, but with coronavirus, about 2 years of oil downturn got compressed into about 2 months. No. So that was a really kind of bizarre thing that not just the oil and gas industry, but the economy's never experienced in modern history. So to put that in perspective, here's a graph of oil and gas production going up, and oil and gas production, let's just use oil. Oil production and consumption normally stay within about 2% of each other. The world's producing 90 million barrels. The world's either using 92 or 88. It stays within about 2% really for almost all time. We hit March, and government lockdowns start coming across the world, certainly across the United States. And by mid-April, we were in full-on lockdown. And now people aren't driving to work. Jet planes aren't flying. You got massive amounts of gasoline and jet fuel, even some diesel, that are just no longer wanted. Well, so the world went from using a little over 102 million barrels a day down to below 70. Literally 30% of the world's demand for gasoline, demand for refined product dropped out of the market in a matter of months. Never happened before. Never seen anything close to it. Now, what I'll tell you is there was a challenge. There were headwinds coming our way in oil and gas anyway. If you look back over the last 10 to 15 years, there's been a lot of investment in oil production, especially in West Texas, right? A lot of Permian investment, literally billions, refinery expansions. The United States was positioning as the sort of new energy, oil and gas fuel supplier to the world. The United States refines, call it 19 million barrels of crude oil a day. A good 4 to 5 million barrels is going overseas. Right. Literally 25% of the oil we refine here is being sold around the world. We've become the world's fuel supplier. Well, sure enough, all this stuff tanks, the global economy tanks, the oil demand tanks. And so we've invested all this money, produced all this supply right before, ignore coronavirus, right before the world's getting more efficient. So we were heading for some headwinds anyway. And you saw this in investors who were starting to pull back a little bit. And you heard banks and people starting to get a little more conservative about the oil and gas business. And this was January and February before coronavirus was hitting us. So this was about to get pretty tough anyway. Then you get coronavirus, and man, it was just a perfect storm. And that perfect storm is still going on. Now the demand is back up. We'll talk about current situation in terms of the numbers here in a minute, but getting back to sort of the environment today, margins are super slim. If you're working in a refinery today, man, I mean, it's super slim. Refineries have shut down around the country. Midstream companies are doing okay, right? Their business is okay. But when they look down the road, it looks like some more challenges are coming as some of the legacy contracts work their way out and they got to do new ones. Oil producers, we've hovered around $40 a barrel for the last 3 months almost now. And that's okay. But you've seen billions of dollars of investment come out. And so, oil field service companies are laying off 80-90% of their staffs are going bankrupt. So it's a tough world today, Jason. I mean, there's just no two ways about it. And it's, once again, when you combine already a challenging economic environment that we were seeing coming into 2020 with the coronavirus downturn, the massive lockdowns, everything else, it just couldn't have gotten any worse. And we're still we're better off today than we were 2 months ago, but it's still a really, really tough time.
Yeah, I would agree completely. And we'll talk about this later, but with challenges, I think we've always seen in our great nation, especially in an entrepreneurial and focused climate like here in the state, not only the state of Texas, but especially here in Houston, there will be breakthrough technology, new things that will come on the horizon of how to do business. It always seems like it's the worst. In 2008, it was the worst. And, and then 10 years later, we had a record economy. So I'm excited to see what the next few years does hold. We'll talk a little bit about this because you talked a lot about the global economy. We're going to talk about data. And I think some of that's going to come up when we talk a little bit about your book later. But I keep hearing we keep seeing these data and comparisons of how the economy is doing. And I keep telling people, guys, you can't compare an economy of Australia to the economy of the United States, right? So when something like global demand or something that has a massive GDP and distribution of oil and gas throughout the world, right? It's apples and oranges, So you're going to see really, in my opinion, a larger contraction to a place like us when you literally shut down transportation, logistics, and everything. When we're a hub, we've got some of the biggest hubs. Not only that, the port region in itself, one of the biggest hubs in the entire world for just basic logistics and transportation, and then factor in oil and gas. Are you seeing that? I mean, is this something that we, as decision makers, do we have to really look at it in a scaled down version to say, is this really the right data? Are we really comparing apples and apples here? Or where would you say our biggest comparison of fair exchange globally would you say we could rank ourselves against as a nation when we're saying, how are we actually doing?
There isn't one.
Okay.
And Jason, look, you said it right. No country is as diverse in their economic presence as the United States is. There's only a couple. China is in terms of its size of its overall economy, but they're not near as diverse as we are, from hospitality to energy to commodity production to high-end technology development. So we stand alone. And once again, our economy might have been poised for some challenges anyway. Now you throw coronavirus into the mix here with this massive lockdown. What are we at? I think 12% unemployment today. At one point it was as high as like 20. I mean, these are unprecedented times. There's nothing to compare to.
Right.
And we have to, that's actually important in and of itself, just to recognize that we are in uncomparable times, because there will be a lot of people that say, wait a minute, this looks a lot like 2016, or this looks a lot like 2008. And so they'll try to draw same conclusions or similar, or build in similar strategies. And that could be folly, right? That could be mistake prone. And then you have to look at this and say, this is a unique situation. And a couple of things I'll unpack here. One is, coronavirus we are likely going to be in some sort of coronavirus sensitive environment, maybe for as much as a couple of years. Yeah, there's talk of vaccines coming, but then could the virus mutate? And even if you do have vaccines, you don't know who's had it, right? So as you're out walking around, does that guy had it? I mean, are you going to wear a t-shirt or a sticker that says I've had the vaccine so I don't have to wear a mask? So it's one thing to think, oh yes, this is coming. At what point does it really change? Does our lifestyle begin to unlock more? I would say we're probably in this for another 12 to 24 months.
Agreed.
Now that's Ryan's hypothesis, but when you look at how we have reacted, and I'm gonna make a pretty bold statement here. I think that the economic destruction, the stress, the anxiety, the downturn, the negative impacts of our reaction to coronavirus is going to exceed the actual pain and suffering of coronavirus. Now, I've got ideas about how we could have done things better, and hindsight's always 2020. But the fact is that these are two challenges we're dealing with: coronavirus itself, and then the reality of the reaction that is simply having a really profoundly harsh impact on our society, on our way of life. And we're going to be in this for a while. So people have to be out there today looking and saying, dude, if I'm just hunkering down, waiting, hoping that it's going to come back, that's not a good strategy. If I'm saying, oh, wait a minute, I remember in 2016, things did this after the big oil downturn. In 2008 and 2009, the housing financial crisis, banking bailouts. No, this is not going to look like that. And so we have to approach this as a very unique situation and recognize that unique situation. Recognize also where those opportunities do lie. Jason, one thing you mentioned, look, we've seen resiliency. In 2016, let's just talk oil and gas now, right? Because in 2016 was a big oil downturn. We saw oil hit $27 a barrel in 2016. And man, that was rough for the oil patch. However, that was unique to oil, right? The entire economy wasn't in a downturn in 2016 like it was in oil. So we had a niche in oil. But what happened was companies got lean, right? As prices were coming down, there was oversupply. Demand didn't shrink, but there was oversupply because Saudi was flooding the market. And people said, how do I get cheaper? How do I lower costs? How do I do more efficient operations with these drilling rigs? Where are my real sweet spots? Can I get my lift cost all the way down to $20 a barrel? Because if so, I can make money even at $30 a barrel. And that happened. And we reaped the benefits from 2016 through 2017 through 2018. The reality is this downturn has been different because we didn't have literally, the Saudis started flooding the market with oil at the end of 2014. Mm-hmm. So it was a year and a half before oil bottomed out at 27, right? This time around, oil bottomed out in 2 months. So then we didn't have time to react. There was no time to engineer and get lean and get efficient. Everybody said, cut now, right? Shut down now. And this, I'm talking about oil companies, and it's massive less from the majors down to the small independents, to the service companies, refiners across the board. We've seen pay cuts. We've seen cost reductions. We've seen capital investments decline. We've seen massive layoffs. So this is a unique deal, and you can't look back in the past and compare. So what does this mean when you start looking at opportunities? It's a very different environment. And so back to your question, who and when can we compare to? I don't think anytime. You have to look at this as a unique time and look for those unique opportunities.
Fantastic. And so you just hit on it a second ago with talking about Saudi just a few years ago, flooding the market, and now we interestingly had. I'll be honest. I was pretty impressed with the ability for the three majors, really Saudi, Russia, and the U.S. to come to some type of agreement through OPEC, and the speed at which they did it. I think that was something that's pretty profound. I think we'd all agree it could have been faster, but getting those three to get on board along with the rest of the nations to try to do and scale back to get pricing kind of back in alignment. But that being said, that's always a sensitive, touchy situation. I'd love to get your insight as to really the demand and really the price battle going on over there between Saudi, Russia, and then what that looks like with us. And what are you hearing? What are you seeing? What do you think it's going to look like?
Well, let's tell the story of what actually happened here, because you say that some sort of agreement, we arrived at some sort of agreement. I would say that we did not actually arrive at agreement. Okay. I would say that Saudi and Russia arrived at agreement. The Americans were sort of slammed into it due to just the way our free market oil and gas operations work. Gotcha. Right. So, it's March of this year, and I'm railroad commissioner, and a lot of folks around the world, I'm certainly I'm not famous. However, in terms of oil circles, right, I've had a lot of exposure, and by the time we get to the end of March, demand is plummeting, and Saudis, and remember that just before literally end of February, Saudis and Russians and the rest of OPEC got into a bit of a pissing match. right? And Saudi was telling Russia, we need to balance this. We got to cut. Things are not looking good. This was independent of coronavirus. Now, they were worried about coronavirus, but no one knew 30 million barrels a day was coming out. So Saudi said, hey, Russia, we got to cut preemptively. We got to balance the market. Russia said, hey, look, I think let's not move too hasty. We think things might be okay. They got into a little bit of a pissing match. And the Saudi crown, or the Saudi prince, who is the head of their oil minister, said, fine, we're going to flood the market. So not only are we not going to cut, we're going to push an additional 2.5 million barrels of oil per day onto the market. This is like the last week in February, right before coronavirus lockdown started. So the oil market was at about 100 million barrels a day, balanced. We saw some demand curbing, some concerns out there. Suddenly, Saudi says, I'm going to put an additional 2.5 million barrels a day on the market. Boom, prices start to tank. Now we go into lockdown. And now in the middle of all this, the Russians and the Saudis are really at odds. So right in the middle of needing the best alignment, because we've got this huge lockdown coming, these two countries they're in the middle of a real disagreement of strategy. End of March, I get a call. It's the OPEC Secretary General calling me saying, hey, Ryan, we got to do something. And we need to get some alignment here. And our two big players, right, the two big juggernauts in OPEC, which are Russia and Saudi Arabia, these guys are struggling to come to terms. Can the U.S. take a leadership role here? And I was like, you know what, we have to. Because if we see oil prices tank to $10, $5, $0 a barrel, the long-term impacts on our oil industry may be the time of thing that we can't recover from. In other words, we may do 10 years of damage in a matter of months here, right? Because we don't have government subsidies in our oil industry like Saudis and Russians do, right? If our oil industry tanks, we have massive layoffs, companies go belly up, there's no infrastructure, no dollars. When it comes time to come back, we won't have the ability to come back. Right? That was my concern. So as a matter of fact, I talked to the Secretary, Mohammed Barkindo is his name. And he and I talked, we had a couple of very long conversations and trying to figure out because the U.S., especially the state of Texas, we have the ability to prorate to try to control production. We got into a very long discussion about how we might do that. You might remember there was a lot of news headlines about whether or not Texas was going to prorate again. And I was an advocate at a certain time of us doing that. Now today it wouldn't help, right? Because the opportunity passed. But at the peak of the demand destruction, there was an opportunity to do that. I end up about 3 or 4 weeks later getting a call from the Russian oil minister, Alexander Novak. So he's the chief guy that negotiates these deals with the Saudi prince responsible for their deal, their oil minister. Real nice guy. We're speaking through a translator, but very thoughtful about, look, at the end of the day, we're competitors. Right? He and I talked about this. We're competitors. But in the end, right now, we have to try to preserve some stability in the oil business, because if we don't, and the entire oil business craters, then in a year when demand comes back, then we may see oil prices skyrocket to $100, $120 a barrel, which is unsustainable. That's bad for everybody. Right. When you get to price like that. So all these conversations, Jason, are going on. I'm on the phone with Alexander Novak, Mohammed Barkindo, trying to figure, I'm getting calls from the U.S. Secretary of Energy, Dan Brouillette, saying, hey, Ryan, what are you seeing? Here's what we're seeing. In the end, what happened was the Saudis said, I'm not going to come to the table unless Russia and the United States come to the table first. Or until cuts are actually made. And what ended up happening was you saw so much downturn in the United States. So Russians said they were willing to do cuts. The United States could never really get aligned. We had different opinions of states, the president, different people weighing in. Majors didn't want to do something. There was competing interests in the U.S. oil business. What ended up happening is by the time we got to call it the end of April, middle of May, so many companies were shutting down rigs. They were pulling investments. Stock prices were dropping. That at that point, Saudi said, I don't need the United States to cut. They're already cutting. Their oil business is in such disarray that they're going to cut. And by the way, to give them credit, they called it. Saudis ended up cutting 3 or 4 million barrels a day from their production to match the demand. The United States has already cut 3 million barrels from our production without doing it intentionally, just because of the impact of the oil industry. So the Saudis waited long enough to sort of force the United States to shut down enough that it balanced what they were going to do. So it was a really kind of fascinating, 2 or 3 month window there to watch all this stuff play out.
Yeah, it's amazing to think about the challenge between the parallel process of working beside your competitors in a way that you have to look at it. And again, I can't wait to talk about that in the leadership component later, because it really requires a certain level of leadership to be able to step into a role and engage in those conversations with not only the best interest of a nation, but also of a global economy and what that means at a later date. Not everybody has the capacity to step into a role like that. That's a tough spot. So, so let's talk about, you'd mentioned it going to negative. You said, so we saw a pretty big shift. I don't know if everybody in our audience understands that. I think those that are finely tuned to the oil and gas industry get it, but for the general populace, and unfortunately, even those that produce the media today, they only fly by. That's negative oil is that can be laying on the front page, and the world, negative oil, Corona, world's ending, Armageddon. So that's what we're going to get from a newspaper perspective. So with that being said, how do we tell us the truth behind what that is, and then what does it look like today? We saw that shift, but then where's it going, and what's the demand starting to look like from there?
Yep. Well, great question, Jason, and understand a little bit about the way oil trading works. In general, think about it. When you're trading stocks, what are you doing? You're buying and selling something that exists on a piece of paper in a computer somewhere. It's not like there's a physical asset. When you're buying and selling oil, there's a barrel of liquid that is getting actually bought and sold, right? And what you're really doing is you're buying and selling. You and I really, I wouldn't say we don't have the ability to, but practically speaking, the common person doesn't have the ability to buy and sell oil. There are traders who do that. What those traders are doing, they are buying and selling a contract to deliver oil on a certain date. Gotcha. So if you're an oil company and I say, okay, I know you're producing oil. I promise to pay you $30 a barrel for your oil you're producing today. I need to also have a place rented to store that oil. And then I promise to deliver that oil to somebody else somewhere down the road, right? Mm-hmm. And contract prices are done for a certain, pricing is done based on those delivery dates in the futures month. So in the month of May this year, it was the June delivery date. So it was people saying, I am trying to find somebody to buy my oil in June. This was in May. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to find somebody to buy my oil in June, a month later. And the problem is there are no buyers. Because if you might remember what was happening was people were concerned about storage. People said, dude, I'm afraid we're going to fill up storage. There's just it doesn't matter whether or not your oil is worse than I don't have anywhere to put it. So I said, someone's got to buy that oil, stick it in have someplace rented to store it. And then they got to have a place to sell it. So if you're a guy in June who has a contract for that oil, you've already promised to take it. You've already paid for it, right? And you got a contract to take it. And I can't find some place to store it, and I can't find anybody to take it in June. What do? You're literally willing to pay somebody to take the oil off your hands because you don't have anything to do with it, right? Like otherwise, because I'm contractually obligated, right? And so what you saw is in that 3 or 4 day span in June, the price went negative because at the end of the day, the storage, the possibility to store the oil was worth more than the oil itself because that was a premium, right? And the supply chain was threatened to get interrupted. So now when you ask how many actual barrels of oil traded negative, it was a very, very small number, but it was the number that defined, it's kind of like, what's the stock price trading at today on a if you said, what are the shares of Exxon trading at? Well, they're trading at whatever the last trade was made at, right? Same thing happens in oil. The end of those, just in that couple day span, when people were really trying to get rid of their oil contracts, they were willing to pay somebody to take the oil. And so not very much oil actually traded negative, but for those couple of days, like, wow, for the first time in history, not having oil, i.e. having the storage, was worth more than having oil. And that was a real weird phenomenon. And then after we got out of that, markets were balancing, supply was coming down. We started to see supply either filling up more slowly or beginning to empty. And that's when prices started to come back up.
Yeah. I got a couple of buddies that are, original wildcatters. And so they're fun because they kind of get a kick out of everybody else's general consensus, and they'll tell you the truth. They're just sitting back, watching themselves lose tons of money and, sipping on a scotch and just saying, well, this isn't my first rodeo. If you're in the oil and gas business and you're especially as a wildcatter, then you probably you probably have seen a few slides in your life. You've probably had a couple of times where you had to sit back and watch your world collapse and then wait for it to come back. And talking about coming back, I know during that period of time, I mean, there were barges just floating around out in the ocean trying to just housing oil.
Yeah.
We shut it down. I can remember, and I think probably you and everybody else can remember, kind of sitting down and trying to get in this rut every day. Of you're sitting in your backyard every day going, okay, here's a week, here's 2 weeks. Oh my God, 3 weeks. We're all just, nothing's moving. And then I think it was kind of the light switch went on and everybody just ran. It was like, all right, gas is coming up, planes are hitting the air. Well, now we're seeing, I think I read this morning in the journal, there's probably 97%, 92% of business travel still hasn't recovered. So you do have people starting to get into vacations and maybe hopping on an airplane, but we're not seeing that translate like I guess we had hoped to the light switch would come on and we would get this at least 2 or 3 month run to get things geared up, thinking perhaps it was going to be a wintertime disease and we would see it kind of spike with the flu. Well, that wasn't the case. So we're just kind of seeing steady, for lack of a better term, I don't know if you've ever seen a non-wave. I think we're still in the middle of a big wave, right?
As a matter of fact, yeah. So if you looked at a graph, you said oil went down to demand. I'm talking about oil was at 100 million barrels a day, dropped all the way to, I don't know, 65, 70 million barrels a day for a few days there, and then started to climb back up. Now we're at about 90, right? So we've come up a lot. I mean, from the bottom. The problem is we're still off 10% from what we can produce and what we were producing in March and February. And now compared to 30% off, that sounds like that's not that bad. But if you were to ignore coronavirus, take that 3-month span out, that 10% would be the largest drop in history. So we're still way off. Wow. A lot of that demand destruction. If the world is using 100 million barrels a day normally, right now we're at 90. That entire 10 million barrels a day is in jet fuel and gasoline. Diesel is back. The market is virtually everybody, all the diesel demand is back. It's jet fuel. The world, even at its peak, was only using about 7 million barrels a day of jet fuel. About half of that is back. So of that 10, about 3 million barrels of jet fuel is still not being used. And then you have about 7 million barrels a day of gasoline that's not being used. And that's a lot of that's the United States, right? We're still hunkering down. A lot of people working from home, right? So business in general to the work commute normally accounts for about 50% of the gasoline we use every day. And so we still have a lot of people not driving to work in the United States. Now the world today is producing about 92 million barrels. So we're producing a little bit more than we're using, but it's getting pretty close. But that's why it's still a challenging environment. Inventories around the world, oil in storage continues to climb. Gasoline continues to climb a lot. Refineries are still running, but they're filling up gasoline inventories. So we're still producing more than the world is consuming. And until that gets into balance, then we're going to have this kind of really challenging market. The good news is it's going to be coming into balance probably in the next 3 or 4 months. I mean, you can look forward and say, okay, we know it's going to correct. The question is, what does that correction look like? And as we start to look out 12 months, I think things start to get pretty exciting. There's going to be some interesting choppiness to it, but it's going to get interesting.
Yeah, we'll unpack that one as we get ready to pivot. I think that'd be a great way to shift and talk about the next 5 years. But let's talk about the interesting aspects of the next 12 months, because I think that's a real big component, and as well as the outlook for shale production and what that would look like. I mean, as far as right now, we've just seen a constant pullback, but you mentioned some optimism, so perhaps you could shed a little light on what you're seeing. Give us the next 6 to 12 months in oil and gas and what the shale output might look like. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think that, well, first I need to talk about some macroeconomic things. So before we get into oil, I do believe that the U.S. is going to have a sustained recession even after we get through with coronavirus. Our government went from being somewhere to the tune of $21 trillion, $22 trillion in debt at January 1 of 2020 to now probably $26, $27 trillion in debt. We've taken on $5 to $7 trillion of debt due to this coronavirus thing. And that is, and this is unsustainable, right? Massive unemployment checks going out, lack of productivity. So our government spend and debt versus our productivity are way out of kilter right now. Mm-hmm. And that's going to come home to roost. I mean, it is, right? We can't sustain this. And so as you start pulling back on stimulus programs, pulling back on unemployment programs, and there's not enough jobs out there, and people are trying to figure out how to get back to work. The long term, the hangover from this, I think, is going to last. So you're going to see a very slow. We're going to be in a down economy, and we're going to see very, very slow growth, I believe, for a while. Now, that's just the overall economic environment. It's going to affect everything. Hotel stays, vacations. It's going to affect healthcare, technology, malls. I mean, retail, all the restaurants. However, let's talk oil and gas. We kind of hit the downturn harder than everybody, right, very early. So there's not going to be a lot of additional downturn for us. We're going to kind of see this slow and steady climb out. What's interesting is because the downturn hit us so hard, and while the rest of the country's gone through a slower downturn and going to go through a slower recovery, what we're going to see is as oil demand begins to come back, I believe, for example, a year from now, global demand for refined product is probably going to be 98 to 100 million barrels a day, close to what it was in January of this year. So by middle to end of next year, we're going to be back to where we were beginning of this year. What's interesting is I don't think the world will be able to produce that much oil at all. Like we've shut down so hard, the United States right now has the lowest number of drilling rigs it's ever had, period. Never had this few drilling rigs running. So when you look a year and a half from now, when we need all that oil in the world, we're not going to be able to produce it because we're not drilling enough wells. And so you're going to see demand for oil start to climb, refined product, everything. Some refineries have shut down. You've had, I think, 4 or 5 major refineries shut down because they couldn't be economic. So all this is going to come home to roost in another 12 months. Over the next 6 to 12 months, I think you're going to see oil prices slowly climb to 50, then to 60. And people are going to go, oh my gosh. And this is a bold claim I'm making. They're going to say, oh my gosh, these oil prices are getting pretty good. Meantime, refining margins are going to climb. And so you're going to see gasoline prices at the pump, or they're at what, $2.40, $2.50 a gallon, something like that right now. You're going to see them climb comfortably into the threes. And the oil and gas business in general, for those who are operating, is probably going to be a pretty good business, I think, as soon as 12 months from now. The challenge is going to be there's few places to invest in it. In other words, there aren't companies that when you say, hey, I'm ready to drill wells, man, $60 a barrel, I'm ready to drill a well. Well, the service companies will be, they've all been decimated, right? You're going to say, hey, I'm ready to go do some action. Let me borrow some money. Banks are saying, whoa. I don't like the oil and gas business. You're going to have a hard time getting access to capital, hard time getting access to services. So I think, unfortunately, you're going to see a lot of investment go overseas, whereas the last decade has been really focused in the United States. But overall, I think the prices are going to be good, and there's some optimism as we kind of climb out on a slow and steady basis. I just wish more of it was going to be in the United States because I think it's going to be tough here to put that opportunity to work.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you hit the nail on the head. Not only are banks nervous, but then you compound what I believe to be a pretty dramatic amount of liability that's going to be resting on their shoulders of debt, not only across the oil and gas industry, but across multiple industries. When you look at mortgages, buildings, all this real estate that's going to fall into their hands, it's going to be interesting. You start taking up the gas prices, taking up inflation around us. It's going to be, can't just dump that much money in the economy and not produce that much money in the economy for such a long period of time and not see a pretty drastic turn in what it's going to, in the fight that we're going to be in coming up. So I think that's a great way to exit this part of our show and then shift to the next 5 years and the type of leadership we're all going to have to put on our best leadership hat to move forward. And so we're going to talk, we're going to move from Texas Railroad Commissioner to CEO, privately held business owner, visionary, and start talking about casting that vision over the next 5 years and how you go out and lead your team. So I think we'll do that now. So for those in our audience, we're going to exit. We're going to pick up here in just a second on round 2 of our episode with Commissioner Ryan Sitton. And we're going to switch over to CEO of Pinnacle ART, Ryan Sitton, and discuss a lot about leadership and what that looks like. And he's going to talk a little bit about his books that he has coming out and how those tie in over the next, really what we're going to kind of capture the 5-year plan of what's coming up. And so for those that don't always tune in, you can find our information at the Economic Alliance Houston Port Region website. Pick a channel to download our show, subscribe to any of our episodes, as well as follow me and my co-host who was unable to join us today. He'll be picking back up with us, Clint Aiken, when we get back into our studio, and we're excited to do that, our Shell studio right down there at the Economic Alliance Houston Port Region. So again, follow us on LinkedIn and stay connected, and we'll talk to you on the next episode.